The radio crackled to life in the briefing room, cutting through the nervous chatter like a blade. Echo 7 Delta, this is Admiral Morrison. You're cleared for immediate deployment. Every head in that room turned to stare at me. Not at Johnson, our squad leader, not at Martinez, our top marksman. At me, the guy they'd been calling diversity hire for 3 months straight. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that comes right before everything you thought you knew gets turned upside down. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. The morning sun filters through the blinds of my Denver apartment, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. At 62, I've learned that some memories don't fade. They just wait. They wait for the sound of helicopters overhead, for the smell of diesel fuel, for moments when the past reaches through decades to tap you on the shoulder. My coffee grows cold as I sit here, running my thumb over the worn edges of a photograph tucked inside my wallet. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 27 years of service, a chest full of ribbons most people never see. But it's not the medals that keep me awake at night. It's the faces, the voices, the moment when everything I thought I understood about respect, about brotherhood, about who I really was, got shattered and rebuilt in the space of a single radio transmission. Some stories you tell because they're easy. Others you tell because they need telling, even when your throat closes up and your hands shake just thinking about them. This is one of those stories. The kind that starts with a young Marine thinking he had something to prove and ends with an old man finally understanding what he'd been carrying all these years. The smell of aviation fuel always takes me back. Yesterday, walking past the airport, that sharp, metallic scent hit me like a punch to the gut, and suddenly I wasn't a retired contractor in Colorado anymore. I was 24 again, standing on the tarmac at Camp Leatherneck, watching the heat waves dance off the helicopter blades in the distance. My hands started shaking, not from age, but from memory. The same way they shook that morning in September 2003, when Staff Sergeant Williams looked me up and down with those cold blue eyes and said, well, looks like they're really scraping the bottom of the barrel now." The other Marines laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to make my chest tighten. Enough to make me question everything I thought I'd earned. I'd graduated top of my class in sniper school. I could put 3 rounds through a quarter at 800 yards in a crosswind. But standing there in that circle of desert camouflage and suspicious stares, all I could think about was my grandmother's voice. "Baby, you're gonna have to be twice as good to get half the recognition." She'd been right about a lot of things, but I was hoping the core would be different. I was hoping that when bullets started flying, skin color would matter less than accuracy. That hope lasted exactly 47 days. Camp Leatherneck in September felt like living inside an oven. The air shimmered constantly, and everything, the tents, the vehicles, the weapons, radiated heat that made your skin feel like leather. Our squad had been together for 3 months, long enough for the dynamics to settle into their ugly patterns. Williams ran the show with the kind of authority that came from surviving Fallujah. Johnson was his lieutenant, a farm boy from Iowa who followed orders without question. Martinez could fix anything that broke and break anything that worked. And then there was me. They called me Thompson, but never by my first name. Always just Thompson, like I was an afterthought, a replacement part that didn't quite fit. During mess hall conversations, they'd talk around me rather than to me. When it came time for equipment checks, they'd examine my gear twice as long, looking for flaws that weren't there. Small things, constant things, the kind of systematic erosion that makes you start questioning your own competence even when you know better. But I kept my mouth shut and did my job. In the military, you learn to eat disrespect in small bites, swallow it down, and keep moving forward. Because the alternative, calling it out, making waves, that was a luxury I couldn't afford. The first real incident happened during morning PT. Williams had us running laps around the perimeter, and somehow I ended up at the front of the pack. Not showing off, just running at my natural pace. I'd been running since high school track, and my legs had always been stronger than my mouth. But when we finished, Williams pulled me aside. His face flushed red from exertion, and something else entirely. "Listen up, Thompson," he said, close enough that I could smell the Copenhagen on his breath. "I don't know what kind of special treatment you got back home, but out here, we do things the Marine way. That means you don't make the rest of the squad look bad, just to prove some point about how fast you can run." I wanted to tell him I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wanted to explain that I'd always been fast, that my father had taught me to push myself harder than anyone else would push me, that running was one of the few things that made sense in a world that constantly felt upside down. Instead, I said, "Roger that, Staff Sergeant," and spent the next week deliberately running slower, deliberately making myself smaller, deliberately diminishing what I was capable of because it made other people comfortable. The resentment built like pressure in a boiler, not just at Williams, but at myself for allowing it. 3 weeks into October, the temperature finally dropped below 100 degrees, but the tension in our squad kept climbing. We'd been assigned perimeter security duty, long shifts of watching empty desert through rifle scopes, waiting for shadows that might or might not be threats. Boring work that left too much time for conversation, and conversation had a way of revealing people's true thoughts when they thought nobody important was listening. "You think they'll send Thompson home early?" Johnson asked during one of these shifts, his voice carrying further than he probably intended. "Why would they do that?" Martinez replied, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "You know, affirmative action deployment. Show the folks back home how diverse we are, then rotate him out before anything real happens." They laughed. Not malicious laughter exactly, but the kind of casual dismissal that cuts deeper than outright hostility. The kind that says your presence is tolerated rather than welcomed, that your contributions are political gestures rather than earned positions. I kept my eye pressed to my scope, watching the same stretch of empty road I'd been watching for hours, but my finger tightened on the grip until my knuckles went white. That night, I lay in my rack staring at the ceiling of our tent, listening to the familiar sounds of the desert, generators humming, distant radio chatter, the occasional vehicle moving between compounds. But underneath it all was a quieter sound, the whispered conversations of men who thought I was asleep, making plans that didn't include me, discussing scenarios where my presence would be more liability than asset. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, trained to detect threats at impossible distances, and I couldn't see the one developing right inside my own squad. The morning everything changed started like any other. Reveille at Go 500, followed by the usual routine of equipment checks and mission briefings. But there was something different in the air that day. A tension that had nothing to do with enemy activity, and everything to do with the way Williams kept glancing at his watch, the way Johnson fidgeted with his radio, the way Martinez avoided making eye contact with anyone. We were scheduled for a routine patrol through the green zone, nothing more dangerous than showing presence and gathering intelligence. Standard operating procedure called for a 4-man team with clearly defined roles. Williams on point, Johnson handling communications, Martinez covering R6, and me providing overwatch from whatever elevated position we could find. Simple, clean, the kind of mission we could execute in our sleep. But as we loaded into the Humvee that morning, Williams made an announcement that sent ice water through my veins. "Thompson, you're staying back today. We need someone to monitor radio traffic from base. Radio duty. The military equivalent of being sent to sit at the kids' table." I looked around at the other faces in the vehicle, searching for some sign that this wasn't what I thought it was. But their expressions told the whole story. This had been decided beforehand, without me, like I was a problem to be managed, rather than a Marine to be trusted. The desert wind picked up as they drove away, blowing sand against the windows of the communications tent where I sat alone, listening to radio chatter and trying to convince myself that this was just standard rotation, just coincidence, just anything other than what it obviously was. But deep down, I knew. They'd found their excuse to leave me behind, and I'd just proven that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one shooting at you from a distance. It's the one questioning your worth from close range. 2 hours into their patrol, the radio exploded with frantic voices. Contact left, We've got multiple shooters in the building complex, approximately 200 meters north of Checkpoint Charlie. Williams's voice came through broken and strained. We're pinned down behind a concrete barrier. Can't get a visual on the shooters. They've got us in a crossfire from at least 3 positions. My hands were already moving before my brain caught up, switching frequencies, coordinating with air support, plotting positions on the tactical map spread across the table in front of me. This was what I'd trained for. Not just marksmanship, but battlefield coordination. The ability to see the bigger picture when chaos was unfolding in real time. "Bravo 6, this is base. What's your ammunition status?" I transmitted, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Running low," came Johnson's reply. "Maybe 20 rounds per man. These guys aren't amateur hour. They've got us mapped out perfectly." Through my scope, positioned on the observation platform behind base camp, I could see the smoke rising from their position 3 miles away. Too far for effective rifle support, but close enough to coordinate the tactical response that might save their lives. For the next 40 minutes, I became the voice in their ears, guiding air support, coordinating supply drops, and providing the kind of battlefield intelligence that turns chaos into controlled operations. When the dust settled, and they finally made it back to base, the silence in the Humvee was different than before. Not dismissive this time, but thoughtful. The kind of quiet that comes when people are re-evaluating assumptions they didn't realize they were making. But it wasn't enough. Competence, apparently, was just the entry fee. Respect was going to cost extra. October gave way to November, and with it came the kind of mission that separates the veterans from the stories people tell at barbecues. Intelligence had identified a high-value target moving through our sector, a bomb maker whose devices had killed 17 American soldiers in the past 6 months. The mission parameters were simple: locate, identify, eliminate. But the execution would require the kind of precision shooting that couldn't be faked or taught in a classroom. Williams gathered us around the tactical map that evening, his finger tracing the route through terrain that looked like God had taken a giant cheese grater to the landscape. "The target will be moving through this valley tomorrow morning between 0800 and 1000 hours. We'll have one shot at this. Maybe literally." He looked directly at me for the first time in weeks. "Thompson, this is your show. You'll be on overwatch from this ridgeline, approximately 1,000 meters from the target's expected position. Everyone else provides security and confirmation. 1,000 meters, in desert wind, with a moving target. The kind of shot that would either cement my reputation or end my career, depending on how steady my hands were when it mattered most." I nodded like it was routine, but inside, my stomach was doing gymnastics routines that would have impressed Olympic judges. That night I cleaned my rifle 3 times, checked and rechecked my scope calibration, and ran through wind calculations until the numbers blurred together in my head. But underneath all the technical preparation was a deeper understanding. This wasn't just about eliminating a target. This was about proving that everything I'd endured, every slight and dismissal and casual insult, had been worth it. This was about earning something I should have never had to earn in the first place. We moved out at 0400, hiking through terrain that seemed designed specifically to twist ankles and shred equipment. By the time we reached the overwatch position, my body armor was soaked with sweat, and my legs felt like rubber bands. But my mind was crystal clear. Below us, the valley spread out like a tactical map made real. Every boulder, every dried riverbed, every potential hiding spot visible through the scope mounted on my rifle. At 8:47, a convoy of 3 vehicles appeared on the horizon, moving slowly through the predetermined route. Through my scope I could see figures in traditional Afghan dress, but identification at this distance required patience and precision. The wind was gusting from the southeast at approximately 15 miles per hour, enough to affect bullet trajectory, but not enough to make the shot impossible. Williams's voice crackled through my earpiece. "Thompson, do you have positive identification on the target?" I adjusted my scope's magnification and watched the convoy approach the optimal firing position. In the second vehicle, visible through the passenger window, was a face that matched the photographs we'd been studying for weeks: the bomb maker. The man whose handiwork had turned American soldiers into statistics. Positive identification confirmed, I transmitted back. Target is in the second vehicle, passenger seat. You have authorization to engage. The world narrowed to the space between my eye and the scope, to the crosshairs centered on a target that represented everything I'd trained for, everything I'd endured, everything I was supposed to be capable of. My finger found the trigger, and I took the kind of deep breath that feels like it might be your last. The shot broke clean and true, cutting through 1,000 meters of desert air like it was following a GPS signal directly to its destination. Through the scope, I watched the convoy halt immediately, figures scrambling from the vehicles in panic and confusion. But the target remained motionless in the passenger seat, and I knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from perfect execution, that the mission was complete. Williams's voice came through my earpiece, but there was something different in his tone, something that sounded almost like respect. Outstanding shot, Thompson. Target is confirmed down. As we packed up our equipment for the hike back to base, I caught Martinez looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not suspicion or resentment, but the kind of acknowledgement that passes between professionals who recognize competence when they see it. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was a start. But even as we walked back through that God-forsaken terrain, I knew that one perfect shot wouldn't erase months of systematic dismissal. Respect, I was learning, wasn't something you could earn with a single moment of excellence. It was something you had to claim, one bullet at a time, until the evidence became impossible to ignore. The memory that haunts me most isn't from Afghanistan. It's from 30 years earlier, sitting in my grandmother's kitchen in Detroit, watching her iron my father's work shirts while the radio played Motown classics in the background. She moved with the kind of efficient grace that comes from decades of practice. But her hands, God, her hands told the story of a woman who'd spent her life making other people's lives easier while her own remained invisible. "You listening to me, baby?" she said without looking up from the ironing board. I was 8 years old, maybe 9, more interested in the sugar cookies cooling on the counter than whatever wisdom she was trying to impart. But I nodded anyway, because you didn't ignore my grandmother when she was speaking. "The world's gonna try to convince you that you're less than what you are," she continued, the iron hissing as it moved across cotton fabric. "It's gonna try to make you small, make you quiet, make you grateful for scraps when you deserve the whole meal. But you remember this. Your worth ain't determined by other people's ability to see it." Chad. At 8 years old, those words seemed abstract, philosophical, the kind of advice adults gave when they couldn't explain why the world was unfair. But sitting in that observation post in Afghanistan, with the smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air and the weight of a perfect shot still settling in my chest, I finally understood what she'd been trying to tell me. Your worth exists independent of recognition. But recognition, real recognition, that's something different. That's the moment when the world stops telling you who you are and starts acknowledging who you've always been. I just didn't realize how much it would cost to reach that moment. December in Afghanistan brought the kind of cold that cuts through body armor and settles in your bones for weeks. But it also brought new intelligence. A Taliban cell planning a coordinated attack on 3 NATO bases simultaneously. The kind of operation that could shift the balance of power in the entire sector if it succeeded. The mission briefing took place in a canvas tent that flapped and strained against the wind like it was trying to escape. Maps covered every available surface, marked with red circles and arrows that painted a picture of coordinated violence on a scale we hadn't seen before. Our squad had been tasked with infiltrating the primary staging area and providing real-time intelligence to air support. But this time, something was different. Williams didn't just assign me to Overwatch. He specifically requested that I take point on target identification and battlefield coordination. Not because he had to, but because the mission required the best available assets, and professional necessity had finally overcome personal prejudice. "Thompson," he said as we prepared to move out, "this is going to be your show. You see something? We need to know about it immediately. You call the shots on engagement protocols. It was the first time in 6 months that he'd looked me directly in the eye while speaking. Not the grudging acknowledgement of competence I'd earned with previous missions, but something approaching genuine respect, the kind of recognition that felt like coming up for air after drowning slowly for months. We moved through the darkness like ghosts, using terrain and shadow to approach the target area undetected. Through night vision optics, the enemy camp looked like a constellation of heat signatures gathered around cooking fires and equipment caches. Approximately 40 fighters, heavily armed, with enough ordnance stockpiled to level half the district. But there was something else, something that made my blood run cold when I realized what I was seeing through my scope. "Williams, this is Thompson. I've got eyes on the target area and we've got a problem." What kind of problem?" "They've got American prisoners. 3 of them tied up near the center of the camp. Looks like air crew from that helicopter that went down last week." The silence on the radio stretched long enough for me to wonder if my transmission had been received. When Williams finally responded, his voice carried the weight of a decision no one wanted to make. "Are you certain about the prisoner identification?" I adjusted my scope and studied the figures more carefully. Even through night vision, the uniforms were unmistakable. Desert camouflage, name tapes, the distinctive silhouette of American military gear. 3 men who'd probably been given up for dead, now sitting in the middle of what was about to become a bombing target. "Positive identification on 3 American prisoners," I confirmed. "Any airstrike on this position will result in friendly casualties." What happened next changed everything I thought I understood about leadership, about sacrifice, and about the difference between following orders and doing what's right. Williams made a decision that could have ended his career. "Air support, this is Bravo 6. Abort the bombing mission. We're going in on foot for prisoner extraction." It was the kind of call that gets people court-martialed if it goes wrong, promoted if it goes right, and remembered either way for the rest of their lives. But in that moment, listening to his voice over the radio, I realized that Williams wasn't just a staff sergeant from small-town America. He was a Marine who understood that some things matter more than mission parameters. And for the first time since joining this squad, I felt like I was part of something larger than the sum of its prejudices. The extraction took 6 hours and used up every bit of tactical knowledge we'd accumulated between us. Williams coordinated the approach routes while I provided overwatch and target identification. Johnson handled communications with higher command, explaining why we deviated from orders without actually asking for permission to continue. Martinez rigged diversionary explosives that would draw attention away from our insertion point. But it was my job to keep track of 40 enemy fighters while ensuring that 3 American prisoners remained safe during the chaos. Through my scope, I watched patrol patterns, identified weapon positions, and called out threats as they developed. When 2 guards approached the prisoner's position, I took them out with shots so precise they dropped without alerting anyone else in the camp. When a larger group began moving toward our extraction route, I coordinated artillery fire that eliminated the threat, while leaving the rest of the camp confused about where the attack was coming from. For 6 hours, I was the eyes and brain of an operation that saved 3 American lives while eliminating a major terrorist threat. And when it was over, when we were finally back at base with 3 rescued airmen and a successful mission report, Williams pulled me aside for a conversation that changed everything. "Thompson," he said, "I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe you a lot more than that, but an apology is where I'm going to start." I waited. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because some conversations require you to let the other person find their own words. "I spent 6 months assuming you were here because someone needed to check a diversity box," he continued. "I was wrong. You're here because you're one of the best damn Marines I've ever served with, and it took me too long to see that." It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't erase months of systematic dismissal or undo the damage that had been done. But it was honest, and it was public. He said it loud enough for the entire squad to hear, making it clear that the dynamic had changed permanently. That night, for the first time since joining the squad, I felt like I belonged. The call came through on a Tuesday morning in January, cutting through the routine noise of base communications like a lightning bolt. "All units, this is Admiral Morrison. We have a developing situation requiring immediate sniper support. I need Echo 7 Delta for emergency deployment. Echo 7 Delta. My call sign. Not Thompson, not the guy they'd been calling diversity hire for months, but the designation that meant precision shooting under impossible conditions. The call sign you use when failure isn't an option, and you need someone who can put bullets exactly where they need to go, regardless of distance or conditions. Every head in the briefing room turned to stare at me. Williams, Johnson, Martinez, all of them trying to process the fact that an admiral they'd never met knew my call sign by heart, trusted my capabilities enough to request me specifically for a mission that was apparently critical enough to bypass normal chain of command. The silence stretched long enough for me to realize that everything I'd endured, every slight and dismissal and casual insult, had led to this moment. Not just recognition from my squad, but acknowledgement from the highest levels of command that I was exactly what I'd always claimed to be, a Marine who could be trusted with the impossible shots. Williams found his voice first. "Thompson, you'd better get moving. When an admiral asks for you by name, you don't keep him waiting." But there was something else in his voice now, something that sounded like pride, not the grudging acknowledgement of competence I'd earned over the past months, but genuine respect for a Marine he'd come to understand was operating on a different level entirely. As I grabbed my gear and headed toward the helicopter pad, I heard Martinez say to Johnson, "Did you know Thompson had that kind of clearance?" "None of us knew," Johnson replied. "Makes you wonder what else we didn't know." It makes you wonder, indeed, about assumptions and prejudices, and the difference between what people see and what actually exists, about the cost of proving yourself to people who should have never doubted you in the first place. But mostly it makes you wonder how many other Echo 7 Deltas are out there, carrying call signs and clearances and capabilities that remain invisible until someone finally bothers to look. The mission itself remains classified, even 20 years later. I can tell you it involved a hostage situation in Kabul, a shot that had to be made from an impossible angle through a window the size of a dinner plate, and stakes that extended far beyond the lives of the people in that room. I can tell you that the shot was successful, that lives were saved, and that the mission concluded with the kind of outcome that gets quietly filed away in folders that few people ever see. But what I remember most isn't the technical aspects of the shot itself. It's the radio transmission that came afterward. "Echo 7 Delta, this is Admiral Morrison. Outstanding work. Your reputation precedes you, Marine." My reputation. Not the reputation others had tried to assign to me, but the one I'd built shot by shot, mission by mission, through months of proving that competence doesn't depend on other people's ability to recognize it. When I returned to base that evening, the dynamic had shifted completely. Not just in my squad, but throughout the entire company. Word travels fast in military communities, and by the time I walked into the mess hall, conversation stopped, and eyes followed me with the kind of attention usually reserved for genuine heroes. Williams approached me during evening chow, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and wearing an expression I'd never seen before, something that looked almost like reverence. "Thompson," he said, setting one of the cups down in front of me, "I've been thinking about what happened today, about what it means." I waited, sipping coffee that tasted better than it had in months, not because the quality had improved, but because everything else had changed. "It means I've been serving alongside someone I didn't understand," he continued. "Someone whose capabilities went so far beyond what I could see that I made assumptions based on ignorance rather than evidence. He paused, looking out through the tent opening at the desert beyond. "I've been in the Corps for 15 years, Thompson. I thought I knew how to evaluate Marines. Turns out I didn't know much of anything." That conversation lasted 2 hours and covered everything from military history to personal philosophy to the ways that prejudice operates below the level of conscious awareness. It was the kind of discussion that should have happened 6 months earlier, but some insights can only be earned through experience, and some people need to see extraordinary proof before they'll acknowledge ordinary humanity. By the time we finished talking, I understood that Williams wasn't a bad person, just a limited one, whose worldview had been shaped by assumptions he'd never bothered to examine. And he understood that I wasn't an affirmative action gesture or a political statement, but a Marine whose capabilities had been there all along, waiting for someone to notice. The irony, of course, is that it took an admiral's recognition to earn a staff sergeant's respect. The years blur together after a certain age, but some moments remain crystalline in their clarity. I can still see Williams's face the day he got word that his tour was being extended another 6 months. The way his shoulders sagged, the brief moment when his professional composure slipped and revealed the exhaustion underneath. He'd been carrying more weight than any of us realized, not just the responsibility for our squad, but for a sector of operations that stretched his resources and patience to their breaking points. Command decisions that meant the difference between Marines coming home alive or in aluminum boxes. The kind of pressure that ages you in ways that have nothing to do with calendar time. "Thompson," he said that evening, "I've got a favor to ask." We were sitting outside the communications tent, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of orange and purple that no photograph ever quite captures. The temperature had finally dropped below 80 degrees, and for the first time in months, the air felt almost comfortable. "I'm recommending you for promotion to squad leader," he continued. "Johnson's rotating out next month. Martinez isn't ready for the responsibility. And frankly, you've earned it 3 times over. Squad leader. The kind of promotion that comes with authority, respect, and the weight of making decisions that affect other people's lives. 6 months earlier, I would have seen it as vindication, proof that competence eventually overcomes prejudice. But sitting there in the desert twilight, I understood it as something simpler and more profound. Recognition from someone who'd learned to see beyond his own limitations. "You sure about that, Staff Sergeant?" I asked. "Some people might have opinions about promoting the diversity higher." Williams turned to look at me directly, and for a moment I saw something that looked like pain flash across his features. "Thompson, if anyone ever uses that phrase again in my presence, they're gonna find themselves on permanent latrine duty. You're not here because of your skin color. You're here because you're better at this job than 90% of the Marines I've served with." It was the closest thing to a complete apology I was ever going to get, and it was enough. Not because I needed his validation, but because I could see that he needed to give it. Some conversations are about receiving forgiveness. Others are about granting it. That promotion ceremony took place on a dusty patch of ground outside Kandahar, witnessed by a squad of Marines who'd learned to see me as something more than the assumptions they'd brought to our first meeting. As Williams pinned the new stripes to my uniform, I thought about my grandmother's words from 30 years earlier. Your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to see it. But recognition, real recognition, that feels different. That feels like coming home. 2 months later, Williams himself got promoted and transferred to a training command stateside. The night before he left, he handed me a letter sealed in a manila envelope. "Don't open this until you get home," he said. "But when you do, you'll understand some things about leadership that I wish I'd figured out sooner." Though, I kept that letter for 15 years before finally opening it on a quiet evening in Denver, sitting in the same chair where I drink my coffee and remember. The handwriting was Williams's careful script, but the words belonged to someone who'd learned hard lessons about judgment and assumption, and the difference between what we see and what actually exists. "Thompson," the letter began, "I spent 6 months trying to figure out what kind of Marine you were, when I should have been trying to figure out what kind of leader I wanted to become. You taught me that respect isn't something you give when people prove themselves worthy. It's something you withhold when you're too limited to see worth that was there all along." The letter continued for 2 pages, chronicling insights that came too late to change our history, but might still influence someone else's future. It was an apology and a confession and a promise to do better, written by a man who discovered that growth requires admitting how much you didn't know. I never saw Williams again after that deployment, but I heard through military networks that he'd become the kind of leader who saw potential before it proved itself, who created space for excellence rather than demanding it overcome obstacles that should have never existed in the first place. Some people learn, some people change, and some people carry lessons forward that benefit Marines they'll never meet, in situations they'll never know about, long after their own stories have ended. Maybe that's enough. 20 years later, the nightmares still come. Not every night, but often enough that I've learned to recognize the signs. The restless energy that builds during the day. The way familiar sounds start to feel threatening. The subtle shift in perception that makes the present feel less real than the past. Post-traumatic stress, the doctors call it. A clinical term for the way trauma rewrites your nervous system, making your body react to memories as if they were immediate threats. Night sweats, hypervigilance, the way crowds make my heart race, and sudden noises make me reach for weapons that aren't there anymore. But the deepest scars aren't from combat. They're from the months of systematic dismissal, the daily erosion of dignity, the accumulation of small humiliations that taught me to question my own worth. Bullets you can dodge. Prejudice gets under your skin and stays there, poisoning every interaction and making you wonder if what you're experiencing is real or just the residue of oversensitivity. The VA therapist I see every other Thursday has helped me understand that some trauma comes from what happens to you, while other trauma comes from what doesn't happen. The respect that's withheld, the recognition that's delayed, the basic human dignity that gets rationed like it's a scarce resource instead of a fundamental right. You earned everything you achieved, she reminds me during sessions when the old doubts resurface. The fact that some people couldn't see your worth doesn't diminish what you accomplished. Intellectually, I know she's right. Emotionally, the 8-year-old boy sitting in his grandmother's kitchen still wonders if he's enough, if he's earned what he has, if the recognition he received was genuine or just another form of accommodation. Some wounds heal clean. Others leave you with weather that tells you when storms are coming, sensitivity that persists long after the original injury has mended. I can feel prejudice approaching from miles away now, can sense dismissal and assumption and casual disregard before they're ever spoken aloud. It's a useful skill, in its way, but it's also exhausting, carrying that much awareness, staying alert for threats that might never materialize while remaining open to connections that might actually be genuine. The trick I've learned is distinguishing between justified caution and self-imposed isolation, between protecting yourself and punishing the world for wounds that weren't its fault, even when they happened on its watch. Some days I get that balance right. Other days, I sit in this chair and remember voices from 20 years ago, wondering what different choices might have led to different outcomes for all of us. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in spring, forwarded through 3 different addresses before finally reaching my Denver apartment. The return address was unfamiliar, but the handwriting looked vaguely military. The kind of precise script you develop when filling out forms becomes a daily routine. Inside was a photograph and a brief note from someone whose name I barely remembered. Martinez, the squad mechanic who could fix anything and break everything, writing from a veterans hospital in Phoenix, where he was receiving treatment for complications from exposure to burn pits. "Thought you should see this," the note said. "Found it in Williams's effects after he passed last month. Figured you'd understand what it meant." The photograph showed our squad during that final mission in December. All of us gathered around a tactical map, planning the operation that would rescue 3 American prisoners and eliminate a major terrorist threat. But it wasn't the mission details that made my hands shake as I held that picture. It was Williams's face. The expression of complete concentration, total focus on the job at hand, with no trace of the skepticism or dismissal that had characterized our early interactions. He was looking at me like a professional looking at another professional, seeking input from someone whose judgment he trusted completely. That photograph captured the moment when everything changed, not just in terms of recognition or respect, but in terms of fundamental understanding about what it means to serve alongside people whose capabilities transcend your ability to immediately recognize them. On the back of the photograph, Williams had written in pencil, "Echo 7 Delta, the Marine I should have seen from day one. Etri." It was an acknowledgement that came too late for either of us to benefit from it directly, but it mattered anyway. Some apologies are for the people who receive them. Others are for the people who need to give them, even when the recipients will never know. Martinez's note continued. "Williams talked about you a lot in his later years, how you changed his understanding of leadership, of judgment, of what it means to see people clearly instead of seeing them through assumptions. He said working with you made him a better Marine and a better man. I sat with that photograph for a long time that morning, studying faces that belonged to young men who thought they understood the world and discovered they barely understood themselves. We'd all carried lessons forward from that deployment, some about courage, some about competence, some about the difference between what people deserve and what they're willing to fight for. Williams had carried forward lessons about leadership and judgment that influenced hundreds of Marines over his remaining years of service. Martinez had carried forward technical expertise that kept vehicles running and people alive through 3 more deployments. Johnson had carried forward communication skills that coordinated operations across 2 different theaters of conflict. And I had carried forward the understanding that your worth exists independent of other people's ability to recognize it. But recognition, when it finally comes, can heal wounds you didn't realize you were still carrying. The morning sun climbs higher outside my window, and the coffee in my cup has long since gone cold. In a few hours, I'll drive to the Veterans Center downtown, where I volunteer teaching marksmanship to younger veterans who are struggling with their own transitions back to civilian life. Some of them are dealing with physical injuries, missing limbs, traumatic brain injuries, the kinds of visible wounds that earn immediate sympathy and understanding. Others are carrying invisible damage, the kind of psychological scarring that makes crowds feel threatening and sudden noises feel like incoming artillery. But all of them are dealing with the challenge of translating military competence into civilian recognition, of finding ways to demonstrate value in a world that doesn't always understand what they're capable of achieving. You have to be patient, I tell them during our sessions at the shooting range. Competence doesn't always get immediate recognition. Sometimes you have to prove yourself repeatedly before people see what was there all along. It's advice my grandmother would recognize. Wisdom earned through experience that no one should have to accumulate. But it's also realistic guidance for navigating a world that still judges people based on assumptions rather than evidence, that still withholds recognition until proof becomes overwhelming. The irony is that many of these younger veterans are more capable, more experienced, more technically proficient than the people evaluating them for civilian positions. They've made life-and-death decisions under pressure that would crush most executives, coordinated complex operations under conditions that would paralyze most managers, demonstrated leadership in situations where failure meant catastrophic consequences. But they're young, they're diverse, they're coming from a military culture that civilian employers don't always understand. So they have to prove themselves all over again, earning recognition they've already earned, demonstrating competence they've already demonstrated, fighting battles that shouldn't need to be fought. Some things change, others remain depressingly consistent across generations. But every few months, one of them calls to tell me about a promotion they've received, a position they've earned, a moment when someone finally saw what had been there all along. Those calls make the teaching worthwhile, make the sharing of difficult memories feel like investment rather than just reliving. Because the ultimate point isn't to avoid struggle, it's to ensure that struggle serves a purpose, that the lessons learned through hardship get passed forward to benefit the next group of people facing similar challenges. My grandmother understood that. Williams eventually understood that. And now, sitting in this Denver apartment with photographs and memories and the weight of experience, I understand it too. The work continues. The recognition comes when it comes. But the worth, the fundamental value of what you bring to the world, that exists whether anyone else can see it or not. And sometimes, that has to be enough. If this story found you at the right moment, tell me where you're listening from. Sometimes sharing difficult memories helps carry the weight. And if you know someone who needs to hear about earning recognition the hard way, share this with them. We all need reminders that our worth isn't determined by other people's ability to see it. It's determined by what we're willing to do when no one's watching, and what we're prepared to prove when everyone is.